Professor Shaw, welcome aboard. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me, Gordon.
No,
Glad to be.
absolutely. This is one of the best books, if not the best book I've read so far this year. When I emailed you, I was actually still in Paraguay, and I heard you on A Magician and the Fool, I think, and the book sounded fantastic, but there is no delivery in Paraguay. I've just been there for about 2 months, and I'm like, oh, I must read this book. So I ordered it to the farm, and now that I'm home, I got to read it, and it's lovely. And congratulations! Thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate the compliment. It's hard to say what you feel when you're writing a book, but I was immersed in it for a long time, and I was delighted with the cover because it felt good just to look at it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, it has the book title has a fun origin story, which it just delighted me. If you would like to
Oh yeah,
share
sure.
where Hellenic Tantra came from.
Well, yeah, it came to me from somebody who didn't like my work. Um, I got an email from a somewhat an unknown person who was disgruntled with my approach to doing my scholarship on theurgy and Neoplatonism. And he disparagingly, I think that was the tone, said, "You're doing nothing but Hellenic Tantra." And I thought, Hellenic Tantra. I kind of like the sound of that. And I thought, yeah, he is right. I am doing presenting Iamblichus and Theurgy as a kind of Hellenic Tantra. And although I had already seen parallels with Tantra and referred to them in a couple of articles, I thought it might be worth fleshing that out just a little bit more and helping people to understand that Neoplatonic theurgy is actually more like Tantra than it is a kind of an ascetic, escape the world program that most people associate with Neoplatonism. So I borrowed his characterization and ran with it.
That's
I didn't
wonderful.
even know who his name is. I
Oh, that's a pity because I was going to ask, did you send him a copy of the book?
Huh?
That would have been the fine. Like, congratulations and thank you. It turned out great. Yeah,
Yeah, it was a fortunate sort of reception on my part because I
nice.
think Hellenic Tantra has a nice ring to it too, I think.
Yeah, like it's I don't know, it's intriguing. And the funny thing is, because I'm glad it kind of like pulled on one of those luminous threads, right? Because it was super interesting going through the book, obviously learning about Iamblichus and Theurgy and so on, but the comparisons with Tantra were like, oh, actually, this is on point. What a strange. I learned a bunch of stuff about Tantra at the same time. I went in for the Iamblichus and stayed for the Tantra, if you will, and I was really surprised. Like, and then I guess that kind of brings up something I was sitting with last night in preparation for this recording. And I want to talk about like a brief overview of the Academy's understanding of Neoplatonism, because it's almost like, how to say this right? What you show in the book is that there's a tension between, there's a similar tension inside Neoplatonism and theurgy as there is in Tantra and the wider, I guess, Vedic cosmovision of and it's always frustrated me to have like a medicalized or gaslit cosmos where it's like, oh no, everything you're experiencing is in fact an error, and the whole point is to get out of here. And it was super interesting to see that tension present in both places, but also, and I'll get your help with this because this is actually what you do as a job. It's almost like there's a similar tension between an overculture or an overculture or a predominant cosmovision and some kind of transformative technology inside, right? Because there's Iamblichus versus the rest of the world, and theurgy inside the academic study of Neoplatonism. There's a strange tension there. Do you know what I mean? Like I sort of said to you in the email, like I'm
Yeah.
feeling around the edges of something here. What do you think that is?
All right. Let me try to address what you're bringing up by taking it step by step. Yeah, there is a tension, I think, within Platonism itself between the kind of theurgical uh, path or discipline and what might be described as the Plotinian one, which is more of an internalizing approach. And the tension that you see in Platonism between those two approaches is mirrored, I'd say, in the South Asian traditions between the tantric approach, which is embracing the body as a vehicle to transcendence, and the Samkhya yoga tradition, which says no to the body and tries to escape from the physical world and the body. Similar kinds of tension. Now, and so you're right that they are in both traditions. But then you added a question which I wasn't sure I understood the direction. You might have to repeat it again.
Yeah, so one of the things that we'll talk about now, and we'll probably do some definitions of Neoplatonism and theurgy and so on, is I'm sitting with what the book has showed or demonstrated, I think, that one of the reasons we've got Iamblichus, quote unquote, wrong, or not, we've got Neoplatonism, quote unquote, wrong from an academic perspective for a while, largely because of our own dualist experience of the body and understanding of the body, right?
So if you're asking about where did Neoplatonism come from, the origins of Neoplatonism, the name itself, Neoplatonism, was not a word that any of the Platonists themselves would have used. Plotinus would not have used it. Iamblichus would not have used it. None of them would have used it. And it's only in the 19th, I believe, 19th century that certain German classical scholars described the school of Platonism from Plotinus on as Neoplatonism. And the characteristics of that kind of Platonism, they highlighted as being more spiritual, internalizing, reading a lot of the Platonic texts in a symbolic and metaphorical way, as providing a sort of spiritual path. And so that's how they characterized Neoplatonism. Which is not really wrong. I think it's a fairly accurate description of it. And some of the Platonists in, say, the 5th century, Eunapius, who wrote about the lives of the philosophers and included Plotinus, Iamblichus, and some of the others, Julian, he distinguishes the kind of Platonism that begins with Plotinus as having a distinctively spiritual or powerful direction. So it was recognized even in the ancient world that Platonism has gone through many different phases and changes. There is no Platonic dogma. That's the interesting thing about Platonism, is that it has as many different schools as there are Platonic teachers. And I don't know why that ringing is happening, but it might be on my end. And if it is, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. But Platonism does not have a truth with a capital T. It recognizes the depth and brilliance and genius, I would even say, of Plato's work, Plato's writing, his dialogues, which are not dogmas. There are more explorations of how the mind works and how we can deepen ourselves and so on. They were also influenced by the Pythagoreans, who tended to interpret reality according to some number symbolisms. And then they also then leaned into some of the Orphic poems as revealing the mysteries of our existence in these kind of myths of Dionysus and the Orphic tradition that way. And then there's the Chaldean oracles, which was yet another kind of source for the later Platonists for what they consider to be a revealed wisdom. So the Platonists were juggling lots of different balls, and depending on what Platonist you studied with, he or she might emphasize one or the other. So Neoplatonism is a label that can be applied to a whole variety of schools of thought and spiritual disciplines, I would say, even today.
And the follow-up there would be, it's funny you said depending on which Platonist you study with.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about Iamblichus that lit up for you in your own studies? I mean, talk to me about how you met this guy and maybe a little bit of his biography as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was first introduced to Iamblichus, I had been, for years previous to that, I had been practicing yoga. I was basically a yogi. I was a celibate and I was doing a lot of meditation hours every day. And I wanted to escape this world and go straight up to the highest levels and have all of the subtle energies of my body go to the crown chakra, where I would dwell in the thousand petaled lotus and all of that yogic stuff. That's what I did. And it works. You know, yoga and meditation is a very powerful tool, and it can really, how would I put it? It can really make you stoned just by meditating without using any drugs. It's powerful. So I was doing that for quite a few years, and then I discovered I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable with what it seemed like to me this imitation of yogis, imitation of Indians, and this kind of affected behavior on the part of some Americans that they were pretending to be like they were from India or something. And I just thought there's a phony element in this, and I wanted to find something within the Western tradition that was equally deep and that it was equally sophisticated philosophically to what I was discovering in the Eastern stuff. And I began to discover it in some of the Platonic writings, like the commentaries by Proclus and the others. I didn't know about Iamblichus yet. I started to read Thomas Taylor, who translated everything.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
He is this amazing genius of a guy. And so I was still immersed in my yoga practices, and they were influenced by a woman who was my teacher, and she taught a kind of Tibetan sort of discipline. And I'd go out into the desert and I would spend a day out there meditating and chanting. And in the process of these chants, I discovered that the chanting went on a lot longer than one would think you could do with one breath. You know, I take a breath and do a chant, it would go a long time. So I was kind of going into an altered state by doing the chants. And then I had the experience that I wasn't chanting, I was being chanted. And that was my existential, that was the phenomenology of what I was having. That the chant was chanting itself through me, but that became a vehicle for me to expand and enter into the whole desert. The whole desert became my body. It was sort of an exalting kind of experience. So, okay, you know, I was one of these yogis doing things and having cool experiences. And I still didn't know about Iamblichus. So I went back to Arizona State, which is the university that I was going back to school to. And my, actually, that was at Arizona State, but I graduated from Arizona State and I went to UC Santa Barbara and got into their religious studies program because I was a religious freak, basically, and was wanted to figure out more about it. And the professor I had in class was teaching a course on religions in the Roman Empire. And he assigned to me to read Iamblichus's On the Mysteries and also to read E.R. Dodds's article on theurgy. And in E.R. Dodd's article, he basically disparages theurgy as nothing but superstition and spiritualistic drivel and a bunch of shit that basically Iamblichus has distorted Platonism and is taking it down a very bad path. And then I was reading Iamblichus on the Mysteries, and I read what he said about the names of the gods and how chanting the names of the gods, well, he basically described exactly what I had experienced in the desert, that he knew what I was experiencing. I could tell by the way he described it. And I had a profound sense of affinity with the kind of world that he described as theurgy, which is that you're not doing the ritual is being done through you. And it's a whole process of learning how to open yourself up to that experience that describes and defines what theurgy is. Divine action is when you make yourself a vehicle for that action. So I thought, this guy, he had it. And I thought, Dodds did not get it. He was looking at it from purely rational point of view, and criticizing this mumbo jumbo of doing chants or being possessed by the gods and the rest of it. And this is sort of an aside issue, but I think it's relevant to Dodds. At the same time, Dodds was very much interested in psychic phenomena, and he was very familiar with the circles at his early 20th century, a lot of mediumistic circles and spiritualists who claimed to be channeling different spirits. And Dodds was highly suspicious of this, and he thought it was having a detrimental effect on English and European culture. So when he argued against Iamblichus and Iamblican theurgy, he was also arguing against the spiritualism of his time.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wrote a paper basically articulating what I thought Iamblichus was doing and writing a criticism of what Dodds was saying as not getting it and not sufficiently understanding, because he was only looking at it through a narrow rationalistic lens, and it was too limiting. And so that's how I got my start and how I was introduced to Iamblichus.
It's wonderful. Did your story about being assigned Iamblichus and Dodds, was that just given to you, or was that given to the whole class? Because it makes it sound like you had a tutor who identified exactly the sort of person you might be and said, "Here, well, I'll blow up your mind with this."
It was just given to me.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I always appreciate that professor for having the instinct to do that. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that I had been a yogi and a celibate and meditating hours every day, and sort of really not of this world, you could say. And I was getting tired of that. I felt like that is, you can get pretty high with that path, but it's limited. And it reminds me of the phrase that Carl Jung said, that perfection is one thing, but wholeness is deeper and richer and more complete. And I felt like I was achieving a certain amount of perfection, but I was lacking wholeness. And so in order to get wholeness, I needed to get into the body. And that included getting into relationships with people of the opposite sex, which means, of course, that you're going to be emotionally all messed up. And I re-entered the world, and it was sort of a personal transformation for me. And Iamblichus was saying it's okay to be in the world. There's ways to be in the world, but by engaging it creatively and with a certain kind of depth and receptivity, it can be actually a vehicle to be more than just in the world, but worlding. You can be part of the creative process.
Yeah.
So I went that way.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think that's what I was getting to when I said overculture. What I mean is that Dodds's rejection of theurgy as superstition in favor of some kind of rationalist, purely intellectual process. There's that same kind of Porphyrian tension, is what I was kind of. It's that plus the fact that the church, which, by the way, the footnotes, the particularly vicious observations of some of the, I guess, Neoplatonists at the time, with of the rise of the Christian church around them, was fascinating, right? Because there's almost like a might have been there as well when you think about the parts of so-called Neoplatonism that did get onboarded into the church, and if they just kind of got, there's like a better timeline, I think, where if they'd onboarded more of that. Being present in the world, and instead of ascending to the gods, calling the gods down into and being better expressions of them. So it's really, I think that's what I meant. There's something really powerful about stepping into the tension between a more embodied, or a more theurgic, I guess is better, a more theurgic experience of the sacred versus. And actually, I'll turn this into a question as well at the end of that observation. Crystal Addy's exciting suggestion that the tension between Porphyry and Iamblichus was at least partially performed for the sense of being initiatory or inspirational. This is what I mean by, like, I want to play with the tension of the reception of a fuller expression of the sacred versus a solely intellectual process. It seems to be like wherever it gets touched, wherever theurgy gets touched, either by other philosophers at the time or contained within the academy, the same story sort of is alive in me at the moment. I don't know. Does that make sense? Does it make more sense now? Is a better way of saying it.
Well, you brought up a few different things. One is the question of what's the position of Porphyry with respect to Iamblichus and theurgy.
Yeah.
And And then there's Crystal Addy's theory that the so-called tension between Porphyry and Iamblichus is not really what we've taken it to be, but that Porphyry is in fact engaging Iamblichus in a sort of a friendly ways of gesture in order to draw Iamblican theurgy out from Iamblichus. I don't buy it. It's not convincing to me. There's so many phrases and passages in the On the Mysteries where Iamblichus clearly speaks to him in a disparaging way, indicating that you just don't get it. And you, I don't know, Crystal could say, well, that is just part, he's just playing the game and that's part of the whole repertoire. I actually think that there was some tension there.
Mm.
And I think it's perfectly okay to have two different ways of interpreting their exchange, and that I don't think it takes anything away from what's in On the Mysteries to see it the way Crystal Addy does, or to see it the way I and some other people see it as reflecting a kind of tension. Because the bottom line is, whatever Porphyry's intentions were, it allowed Iamblichus the opportunity to draw out all kinds of things in On the Mysteries that otherwise would not have been drawn out had Porphyry not sent him that letter to Enibo, your student. And I don't know, that's never been, I've never been too, I would have to say I've assumed that there was a tension there. There's other reasons I think that there was. For one thing, Porphyry was Plotinus' student. He wrote the Enneads. He wrote the biography of Plotinus. He probably expected to be the leader of the Platonic school when Plotinus passed. And at the time that Plotinus passed, a lot of Platonists were going to Syria, to Apamea, to study with Iamblichus, this flashy guru who was talking about spells and possessions and all these things. And that sure didn't sound like the traditional Platonic tradition as Porphyry understood it from Plotinus. And also, his own authority in the Platonic circles was being, how would I say, somewhat challenged by the fact that people were being drawn to Iamblichus. So I think to some degree, he did want to critique theurgy as not being a full-blown, deep kind of Platonism. And there's still some people who think that that's a valid critique. I thought that Iamblichus took it and responded and tried to show that Platonism and Pythagoreanism actually unfolds in a way that's consistent with theurgy. But in trying to write about what Iamblichus said in distinction from what Plotinus says, it almost makes it seem as if they were at odds with one another. And I don't think that if you were in the room with Plotinus, you would ever come out of it thinking, well, he doesn't really get it. You know, you'd come out of that room blown away. It would be, that would be what I would call darshan, and being in the presence of an enlightened being. Plotinus was unquestionably profound. And I think that he expressed his understanding of the soul and the soul in the world in a way that could have invited dualistic interpretations, and I think in some cases it did. But he was here in the body helping, you know, kids in the place where he lived, and sort of overseeing a little entourage, a community. He wasn't a hermit cutting himself off from the world. So I don't even see theurgy of Iamblichus being at odds with Plotinus. In fact, I don't want to keep blabbing on about this, but a great scholar of Neoplatonism named A.H. Armstrong, the man who translated the Enneads for the Loeb series, he said there's two different strands in Plotinus. And Iamblichus simply followed one of those strands, and it leads to theurgy. And the other strand, I'd say, that Porphyry more emphasized, which is not the theurgical one. So but it is interesting. There's a rich history there.
Yeah, and I guess the thing for me is And I'm glad you get into Dr. Kreipel's work, or at least open with, or or allow Dr. Kreipel's work to invite almost like repositioning the easy divide between Porphyry is much more of an intellectual process, or suggesting that, and Iamblichus or Theurgy is much more of a embodied. You need to do ceremony, you need to do prayer, and so on, which is true enough, but actually a lot of it, my favorite chapter in the book is on, I guess, the theurgic imagination, right? Because we're still coming at it with a modern theory of mind, which means that it's almost like we're cutting the sandwich on the diagonal rather than the horizontal when we want to like lay out the differences between Porphyry and Iamblichus when it comes to what happens internally. This is the trouble. Like if we say Porphyry does internal and Iamblichus does external, that's wrong. Like that's actually not correct. And it's because we think that I guess it's like the intellectual process is solely internal, but actually what you're doing, as far as I could read in that chapter from a theurgic perspective, activating the capacities of the imagination is interacting with, or provides a layer of interaction with the realms of the gods, right? So you can't just say, oh, I'm doing inner work as if it isn't attached to the rest of the cosmos. That was my favorite chapter.
Oh, the one on imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's very short too. Well, the interesting thing is, I think that the tendency or the tension between those two approaches is with us today, with people's engagement with their spiritual life. I mean, to the degree that people are interested in spiritual development, whatever the hell that means, it's almost a contradiction in terms, spiritual development,
Mm-hmm.
like getting a PhD and being spiritual, um, but the point is. There's an emphasis in some kind of spiritual practices of going within and shutting out the externals. And there's another approach that says you can allow what rises up in our imagination to be used as a vehicle for transformation, and also to even engage the world as providing symbolic structures for transformation. And the reason I moved towards Ficino at the end of this book was because I think Marsilio Ficino in the Renaissance follows that Iamblician and theurgical line of engaging the material world as being filled with symbolic structures that can help us reintegrate and bring the soul into a kind of divine state. Um, Not by shutting the world out, but by learning how to open up to it in the way that, how would I put it, in the way that we're being invited to open up to
Mm.
it. Um, I think the key idea, I think, for theurgy and for imagination, divine imagination, as Iamblichus talks about it, is somehow allowing ourselves to be receptivity. And that's tricky. And so sometimes, people will do certain kinds of Buddhist practices of just sitting and letting go, sitting and letting go, and not pursuing thought as a way to become receptive. And I think that's valid. But people can also become receptive by engaging in certain kinds of activities, by being receptive to, like, people who are dancers. They might just open themselves up to the dance, and so that the dance is dancing itself through them. They become the rhythm of the dance. They become the dance, or it's like a song. So the key is to become receptive in theurgy and theurgic imagination. And however a person best achieves that kind of receptivity, that's what they need to do.
Mm.
So, what did you like so much about that chapter on imagination?
So
More than what you said.
my last book was about essentially the animist theory of mind, and very, very interested in Amazonian cosmovisions and so on, and really just a whole bunch of different indigenous cosmovisions. And in Aboriginal Australia, there is, and I'm just painting with a very broad brush here, so go with me. When you enter the dream, like when you are dreaming, there is the opportunity to have those ancestor beings from the dreaming speak through you and express through you. But you can also, by virtue of being a human who can also dream, it's kind of like they have big dreams and little dreams. And so the big dreams is when we might say the archetypal stuff is coming up and seeks to be expressed through you. But you can also, by virtue of being a human, generate small dreams in the dream state. And there's an element of discernment in working out, like, oh, hang on, did that come from God, let's say, or is that because I ate pepperoni pizza at 2 a.m., right? So what I was super interested in this chapter is almost like my version of what happened with you finding Iamblichus and realizing, oh, this is like chanting in the desert and becoming the chant and the desert, is I can see in his descriptions something that looks true elsewhere, which is that inside that, this is the trouble with when we say inside, it is because it's almost like that Gospel of Thomas stuff, right? Like we're going inside to find a way for the outside to express through us. And that's where like the distinction fails as we're trying to come at it from a modern theory of mind. And that was what was so exciting for me. I'm like, oh, I'm seeing stuff that looks like whatever Iamblichus was doing looks like what Shuar shamans do, or what you find in Aboriginal Australia, that same more sophisticated map of the so-called inner landscape in a way that's actionable. Like, oh, I've been there, and here's some stuff. This is how you do it. These are the things you will find. This is the implication of the inner in the outer, and vice versa. It's that that's what I found so interesting. I could see Iamblichus was talking about a true thing that I've seen in the Amazon or somewhere, just described slightly differently.
I think that's, for me, that's the beauty of Iamblichus's Platonism, is that he gives people a framework, a kind of an intellectual framework, you could say, and that can be applied to profound experiences in various different traditions, whether it's the Amazonians or the Australian Aboriginals, or I was recently at a conference with a Santeria shaman and priest. And I don't know if you know anything about Santeria, but it's a sort of a Cuban religion that works with nature spirits and these orishas, which are the divine spirits and dark spirits. And the fellow who was giving his presentation is a Platonic scholar and has
Nice.
published his PhD on Proclus. So he knows all of that, but he also happens to be this leader of a Santeria community. And he was describing to us the possessions that happen to people in his group when they are initiated into the orishas, which is just like what Iamblichus was describing. People become possessed by the gods. And just like Iamblichus, this fellow, his name is Jose Redondo, he said that you have to figure out how deeply the God is in the person. Is it just on the surface, or is it in the middle, or is it a complete possession? Then you also have to figure out which God it is. And you can figure that out by the characteristics of the behavior of the person. And you also have to figure out, is it a real possession, or is it some lower spirit that's trying to pretend like they're a God?
Yeah.
Or is it possibly the person itself faking it in order to get attention? In other words, all kinds of discernment are required when you're doing this kind of work, but all of those things are mentioned by Iamblichus in his book on the mysteries. So I thought, I've only been reading about it and trying my best to imagine myself into that world and drawing a little bit from my own experiences. And here I had a Santeria priest who's experienced it and engaged it directly. And then somebody in this room, in our group, asked him directly, "Have you been possessed?" And he said, "Yes, I have." And then he explained these different levels of possession. But and I'm saying this in response to your point about what Iamblichus can provide to different cultures. And it is a kind of common language to talk about profound transformative experiences, that you can use Iamblichus to explain what's happening in a Santeria community. You can use Iamblichus's distinctions to describe what's happening with your Aboriginals or with other people as well. That, to me, is the beauty of what he came up with, a kind of a syntax for spiritual transformation. And that's what his theurgy, Platonic theurgy is, seems to me.
I agree completely. So the weird synchronicity, of course, because I was listening to you when I was in Paraguay. I've spent a bunch of time with Kimbanda and Umbanda groups in Paraguay and Brazil just then. And in at least the communities that I was instead of the word possession, they use the word incorporation. And I've been really sitting with that. And then get home and I'm reading Hellenic Tantra and we're talking about the same thing once again. Like here's Iamblichus describing using his words something that I just saw. And with the language of incorporation, it almost looks, rather than possession, which has, it's our fault, but has a lot of emotional overlay.
It's scary
Incorporation is
because
like
people
more
have
precise.
a demonic connotation with
Exactly,
possession.
exactly. Whereas
Okay.
to incorporate it, because it's the same thing, it's like you fully incorporated the systems of protocols, like being able to drink certain amounts of vast amounts of liquor and not be affected by it, or eating glass in some of them and be being fine, but
Right.
testing the spirit and finding what level of incorporation it's at. Because what was really alive for me all through Paraguay, sitting with this idea of incorporation before reading your book, was, well, quote unquote, we have that in Western traditions as well. The word incorporation makes it more invitational to a bunch of mystic practices that do look like Ficino, that do look like his, astrological alignment resonant ceremonies, where it's like, well, I am incorporating Venus, but I'm not being fully, quote unquote, possessed unless I am, right? When that happens. And it suddenly, this is much like the imagination chapter, it moves it into it's a dangerous thing to say, a universal framework, but like you can squint at something. Terence McKenna said, if it's real, it can take the pressure. There's something like behind all of it that's real, that doesn't submit to, obviously, single descriptions. But I read in your book and Iamblichus through you an understanding that looks the same as what I saw like 3 weeks ago in Paraguay and Brazil. And it's amazing that it's 1800 years later.
Uh, that's really I'm delighted that you were able to see that in what I wrote about Iamblichus. And the term incorporation, uh, in distinction from possession, I think it's a little bit less jarring to the
Mm,
ears, to our ears, than possession is. Um, but it might energetically if be the same, but
yes.
incorporation might allow for a kind of a softer way of appropriating that experience.
I also think it contains the integration, right? So this brings Ficino back in, because you'll do your Venusian ceremony, but presumably you will see or experience the integration of that, which is that really Neoplatonic idea of being, you don't like achieve union with the one or whatever and then stop. Like the whole point is to continue to, I guess, from an Iamblican perspective, continue to express that throughout your life, continue to be, I don't want to say fuller or purer. All the words kind of fail, right? But to be a healthier expression of that which seeks to express through you, and that doesn't, you don't stop that, right? Like, so there's, what I liked about incorporation is that it, again, it's our problems, it's our words, right? Like possession has an almost binary, like, are you possessed? Yes, no. Whereas incorporation gives you more of that.
I understand that, yeah,
Yeah,
the yes or no, but that's why I like that he said, well, there's various levels and degrees of
exactly.
possession,
Yeah, yeah.
which is more like your incorporation. But all right, so I understand where we are in engaging this and appreciating Iamblichus providing a kind of universal type of syntax for these things. What do you think is driving this? I mean, why are you going to Paraguay and sitting and studying with these individuals? What is it in you or in me that's pulling us into this I kind of call it a hunger for depth or meaning? I'm sure you've thought about it and wondered about it and why you, and it doesn't happen to everybody,
Yeah.
but and it might even make you feel a little bit strange compared to some other people, but it's what's happening with you. You
Mm.
know, how do you make sense of it?
So for Rune Soup and for my books and for the rest of it, I have a kind of unofficial mission statement of looking, I like to say, I'm looking for the things that allow us, quote unquote, us Westerners, to look eye to eye with other cosmovisions, other so called cultures around the world. I'm looking for, because I know this is why I said universals is a dangerous term. Like I don't mean it, neither you, in the 19th century sense of universals. But I do think that, and this is the thing that's alive for me with the Iamblichus, that there are actually structural universals, because the thing we're talking about is real. And the thing that I'm interested in is what does our quote unquote fumbling around for the real thing look like? Because it looks and we'll know when we find it. This is my comparative thing. This is why I love Dr. Kreipel. We'll know when we find it because it looks a lot like what we find elsewhere around the world. And
Yeah.
so I'm looking for the universal structure of magic, because I actually am looking more for permission to know that it's there, because whenever I talk to anyone from like I said, anyway, like witches in the Philippines or Kimbanderos in Brazil or wherever I look for it, they take it as given that, of course, what we're talking about has some kind of, there is like a universal framework of magic, let's just say. It's a dumb term, but we'll go with it. And
They would listen
I'm
to
playing around. I'm like this, trying to be like, well, maybe it's there. They're like, yeah, of course it is. Like, catch up.
they would listen to what you're saying right now and laugh at you, thinking, "What's this? What's this fellow onto? What?
Yeah.
It's right in front of his face. We
Yeah.
live it. We do it." And he's trying to put it into some sort of conceptual framework and wondering, "Is it real? Is it not real?" Yes, it's fucking real.
Yeah.
It's their lived reality, and I think that sort of attitude that I just sort of acted out there comes up on the mysteries where Porphyry says, if we assume that the gods really do exist, and Iamblichus says, that's not even the right way to talk.
No.
You don't even talk that way. Of course they exist. If they didn't exist, we wouldn't even be here. We couldn't see. We wouldn't be breathing. It's a given. And to sort of siphon it off into well, what if they did exist, is like to take us out of the reality of those beings that Iamblichus wants to stay rooted in. And Porphyry wanted to, kind of conceptualize about it.
Yeah.
And
Last year, visiting some friends who are now Ariki Kaiputahi in New Zealand, we were talking about the very curious overlaps between dynastic Egyptian cosmology and Maori cosmology, which has led to some, let's just say, not very good history books suggesting that doesn't matter.
What are the two cosmologies that
so we're talking about Maori cosmology and
Maori?
dynastic Egyptian cosmology, right? So the sun god is named Ra. Like there's some surprising amounts of parallels that have led to some, like I said, not very good history, but like lost tribes type stuff. Not very good history books looking at this overlap because it's there. And I was talking to some Maori elders, one who's a tohunga and faith healer, about this. And I asked, like, why are there so many overlaps, which I'm coming to in a minute, between Maori cosmology and ancient Egyptian cosmology, given that we're talking about a 3,000-year time gap. And he says, oh, we're from the same dimension. Like, mind blown. But, but one of the things that we were talking about that spurred that conversation was I was sort of explaining that in dynastic Egypt, if you were in love, you would say, I am with Hathor. Or if you are angry, like, I'm with Set. Like, this is the Anglican thing of, like, there is no difference between rage and Set. So to say let's assume the gods exist is already to dissociate from the fact that no, the existence of love in the universe is Hathor. Like, that's what it is. And in Maori cosmology with the atua, it's the same. So you are with the particular atua of love or anger or what have you. Like when I say when you experience, as you are experiencing that, you are the cosmos experiencing that at the time. So that's like when I see that in the Iamblichus, I'm like, yeah, this is another one of those universal frameworks, I think.
Yeah, and that's what I like about Ficino. He was bringing that back into the Renaissance circles that he was in. And his polytheistic approach to human experience. And I think one of the more recent developments in psychology was James Hillman, the Jungian, who developed what he calls polytheistic archetypal psychology, where he, I am in Set, that sort of thing. He wanted to kind of revive that sensitivity. And that's that's a completely different way from the way most people think, because I think our culture is materialist.
Yep.
We don't believe that there are any spirits. I mean, the standard acceptable way to make sense of things is that everything's matter. There's no spirits. And the truth of the matter is nobody believes in God, except they want to shore up some sort of institutional sense of importance. But we're completely a materialist culture. And until we recognize how our minds work that way, we don't realize how much resistance we have to what you just talked about.
Yeah.
I am in set, I'm in this, that sounds like animism. And exactly.
Yeah.
It's
My book is called Animistic, so yeah.
so tell me, are you writing a book or have you
No,
written
no,
a book?
that is, I'll show you. It's right here. That's my book, Animistic.
Oh well, let me look at it and write it down. I want to write down the
Oh,
title.
there you go.
And
I will happily send you one.
no, I'd love to see it. Okay. Anal Mystic.
Annie.mystic, Animistic.
Mystic.
Yeah, it's like animistic, you get it.
Well, it's wonderful. So you're totally on board with
Well, so
animism.
it's what you were just saying there about us. This is what I was struggling, because it was very early in the morning, struggling to articulate at the beginning of the episode, was the Iamblican, or the tension between theurgy and what's going on is it's still present, right? Like, so we're talking about this mode of being, and it not so much not fitting in the culture, but Iamblichus is still controversial. I think that's a bit. I should have started there. Iamblichus is actually as controversial now as he was then, because what he is willing and daring you to experience is controversial, I think. Still, does that make sense? I think that's what I was trying to get at when I was saying overculture is like, we're here
That's
now.
why
Yeah,
that's why there was such resistance to him by people
yeah,
like Dodds, who were upholders of the rational, classical view of reality, which is also materialist.
yes,
That's why he was fascinated with a psychical phenomena. In fact, he was the president of the Psychical Research Society in England for a few years. So I think that he was torn, E.R. Dodds. On the one hand, I think he was drawn to it and fascinated with it. And on the other hand, he resisted it. And so the resistance he had to Iamblichus was a resistance to his own interest in
mm,
psychic phenomenon. Um, but the materialists will say that there is no telepathy, there is no all these other sort of super psi powers. There can't be any of those because there's only matter here. So there can
mm,
be no near-death experiences. There can be no visions of somebody who died and spoke to you after no mediums can speak to the dead. And Iamblichus is saying all of those things can happen. And
yeah,
I'm providing you with a kind of a Platonic and Pythagorean rationale for why it's okay to say that those things can happen. So we have to say that no, it's not Platonic and Pythagorean. It's a spiritualistic dribblings, as
yeah,
Dodds put it.
yeah.
There's a
You have
resistance.
Yeah, you have to live in a very different universe. You can't just like clock out at the end of the day. If you tangle fairly with the Iamblichus, you live in a very different universe at that point. And it's real, like that the Dodsian tension. I was unaware that he was on the edges. There's obviously a sad and conflicted story there of loss and fear and so on, which is in its own way kind of poignant. That if he was at the edges of interest of psychicalism and spiritualism and so on, but not finding or not getting what he wanted. That's a little bit sad. There's sort of a Freud part there, really, isn't there? Like, I'm on the edge of this,
Yeah,
whereas
yeah,
Jung at
he's
least went all
at
in.
odds with his deepest desire. He's at odds with, but he's such a brilliant man. I can't help but admire his brilliance. But I'm really glad that you've had engagements with Jeff Kripal, because he really is been a fundamental importance as a voice, trying to bring out not just the Iamblichus, but a whole variety of comparative insights into who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
That's much deeper than the materialist paradigm. And he's been attacked a lot,
Oh
Kripal,
yes.
for
Yeah.
his approach and his scholarship. And he's remarkably agile with the criticisms, and he's very well aware of all of the scholarly moves and discourses, and he's a real warrior, I would say, fighting for this deeper understanding of who we are.
And
And,
a far
and
more
so,
patient person than I am, because I I'll just leave it at that.
oh,
He can patiently respond to them again, and like I no, that's
he's even tempered. He's
yes.
very even.
All right. So one of the other things that, especially as we've spoken about it like this, and I think we've tabled something that people who listen to Rune Soup are very interested in fortune telling, very interested in divination, and so on. And Iamblichus is rather a fan, but rather a fan in the way that we were just talking about, inside this inside a theurgic cosmovision where the imagination is some kind of real. Like we don't even think the spirit world is real, essentially, with the word that's why I don't like the word imagination. I use imaginal, which is only slightly better, but at least it's jarring enough in conversation to move people out of the normal tracks of thinking. But so tell us about Iamblichus's understanding of divination and almost like what it does for the soul.
All right, let me see. Draw into that. Well, basically, in order to be a theurgist, you have to be a diviner. It's required, essentially. Um, all theurgy is a kind of divination, and the main form of divination is to draw in the light, which he calls photagogia, drawing in, leading in the light, divine light, and there's as many different ways to do that as there probably are different traditions. So you were just talking about the Aboriginals or the Amazonians. They're all doing forms of divination, I would say. The people in the Santeria communities, they're doing divination, which is essentially making yourself accessible to what is deeper than just the materialist control of our outer world. It's being open to, I guess if I use poetic language, a kind of magical reality that lives in the world and lives in us. Divination is the path for doing that. Um, the thing that's interesting about Iamblichus is on the mysteries is that he doesn't give you specific recipes or rituals. Do this, do that, take three, sprinkles of this herb and that. He doesn't do any of that. He just talks about them. And that's kind of frustrating. And at the same time, I thought, well, maybe there's some wisdom in that
Yeah, there
because it
is.
allows for different people with different specific rituals to be able to plug theirs into what he's talking about. And he describes it in such a way so that you can do that. So,
Yeah. See, it's wonderful you said that. I just want to pause. We'll go back to the
yeah,
divination thing, because I read on the mysteries 20 years ago, as part of my early journeys with Western ceremonial magic and so on, because you kind of you read on the mysteries so that you kind of go, Iamblichus correct, Porphyry incorrect, you should do ceremonies. Like you that like and so done, right? But re-encountering him through this book on the journey I've subsequently been on, like what you were just saying there, because I've been into the Amazon and seen a guy turn into a jaguar. Like I've seen stuff happen
you
that
say that again
no,
about the jaguar?
I've seen someone basically half turn into a jaguar in the jungle, right? So like when I come to Iamblichus now, and he doesn't say like, oh, referencing Ficino and Renaissance ceremonial magic, he doesn't say on a Friday at sunrise do this, right?
No.
He doesn't. It's not that, but there's something more powerful in a way. Like I'm reading him very differently because I'm after an event like that in the same way you're after the event in the desert, where what I experienced the real, and his like lack of precise details is actually to the advantage, not the detriment, because it's not a recipe to make a cake. It's it's telling you how to dance. Like not even telling you how to dance, it's inviting you to. And but it's the thing that I'm really alive, or that's really alive in me about encountering the Iamblichus through this book, is I didn't think there was much detail last time. Now, that's not my sense at all. Like, because I felt the same world that what he could not have said more, because it would have actually made the description worse, because it would have made it smaller. I don't know. Does that make sense?
That I've come to that perception myself, and it took a while to get there, but then it just struck me that this is the right way to do it. The way he
Mm.
did it doesn't narrow it and make it smaller, as you put it. But in terms of divination, when I used to lecture to my students who were Catholic kids at a Catholic school, I said, we talk about people taking shrooms and going into an altered state. I said, when you go into a church and you say a little old woman doing her rosary, she's going into an altered state. That's a form of divination. She's repeating this prayer. She's going into a state that is not her normal state. She is communing with the gods as she understands them, through that Holy Mother Mary Grace, and she doing the rosary. And I think that rituals are good ways of stimulating the divinational experience. I don't know what was going on with you when you saw somebody being transformed
Oh,
into a jack.
ayahuasca, obviously, but like I know the difference between
Okay.
like I know the difference between seeing things because my vision is altered and what was there, and I don't know exactly what I saw. But he was not a man. That was my shaman, and he was not a man for some of that time, and
I
that's one of those like, okay,
You
wow,
knew that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
You
yeah,
knew that, and he knew you knew that.
yeah,
And that's the power of it too, is that he knew you knew that.
yeah,
And the jaguar knew you knew the jaguar.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was actually during my limpia, so I was in the middle of the Maloka, and so he's singing the Icaros, and he's like, his whole shoulders turned into like cat shoulders, and his head came down, and obviously I purged basically a whole bucket as as this was happening. But I that's one of the things I think that I was thinking about when reading the imagination chapter, because whatever was going on there was an arrival from, let's say, the imaginal or the theurgic imagination of Jaguar. And it just was, and this is divination, right? Like, to like, we say it's divine, but it's actually divinate, right? Like, divination is becoming divine, right? So this
Correct.
actual process, and I think what Iamblichus, so if you think, and everyone listening to this show does, that divination is some kind of true, and you can just do that on telepathy and remote viewing and whatever, like, that we have a relationship to the future that can yield some sort of accuracy, for one thing. But for that to work, you have to be open. You have to be open up to the universe. So to divinate, like to divine, is to allow the cosmos to flow through. And that was the bit that is like, what I liked about Iamblichus and divination was that he almost, you have to be a diviner before you divine. Like, it's not actually in the doing. It's like you actually have to open up the internal gates, and then it will work. And I find that really interesting. So that every time, not in theory, like every time you throw down some tarot cards to say, should I go to the post office today? But more um, that idea that every time you do this, you are opening the gates again. You're letting the cosmos flow through. And I thought that's like correct. That's another one of those things that, yeah, that's exactly that's exactly how that should be described.
And he says explicitly, divination or mantike is not about learning the future.
Mm.
It's about becoming united with the gods. And that's what divination is. You might be, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a couple of books that there's a fellow I know named William Barnard, and he wrote a book about ayahuasca and Santo Daime, and I know him, and he has an ayahuasca group in Texas, and he's he's a leader of that group. And there's a fellow I think in the Netherlands who wrote a book about ayahuasca, and one of the chapters is Santo Daime as a theurgic religion. Are you familiar with the Santo Daime
Yeah, yeah,
brand?
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
But I mean, that's also one of those, I don't even need to read the chapter to be like, oh, yeah, I get, I get,
right, right. Well, I
I
read
get the
his
point.
chapter because I wanted to see what he was up to,
Yeah.
and he gets it. He's read
Mm.
Iamblichus, and he applies the Iamblichian theurgy very, very well to his experiences in Santo Daime. ayahuasca practice. So there's some people who are recognizing what you recognize in Iamblichus, that it's a kind of a, you careful about using the word universalizing, a universal
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
language, but it's a very applicable kind of structure or appreciation for spiritual experience that somehow allows Santo Daime, ayahuasca, Aboriginals, people to see what they're doing. And so why do we like it? Because we're rational, you know. Iamblichus is rational, but he's not limiting it to what's rational. And sometimes I wrestle with, how do I practice my rationality in a way that allows the more than rational to still be alive
Mm.
in my understanding of things, or even in the way that I explain things. And that's a hard one to kind of wrap your head around, because my guess is that you've probably written about this yourself, is that there's no set formula for
No.
doing that that can be rationally described. It's sort of, I describe it as a sort of learning how to be receptive to
Yeah.
moments. But go
If
ahead.
there was a set formula, it would have been in on the mysteries, right? Like, but there isn't in the same way. So I have a similar story. Mine inevitably involves psilocybin mushrooms, but my version of mantras in the desert was about 10 years ago. Mushrooms on a Welsh beach overnight, saying all the Orphic hymns to the ocean, and that was powerful. And that was the whole. I wasn't sure who was doing the hymning, but like when you described it that way, I'm like, I'm not sure what's going on here. Like, and it felt actually like the mushroom was saying them, but it's more. I certainly wasn't. Like there was this whole, the cosmos had just made this whole moment, and that's all that was happening. And it was, so it's kind of like, if there was a precise formula, you would write it down, but there can't be a precise formula because it breaks it again. It's like, I keep coming back to, because you mentioned Jung a couple of times as well. The advice when you do active imagination to go inside and follow what moves, you can't say it any more detailed than that, because
Exactly.
if you do, it breaks. And it's this, that's
Right.
that same moment.
One of the things that I've had the opportunity to practice for years is dream work, which is working with a kind of an active imagination in a group. And we enter into somebody's dream and we work with the dream images, but you can never, ever know how
Yeah.
you're going to do the work before you enter into the dream. And you don't know what the image is going to present, because every image has its own authenticity or its own autonomy. And it's, I think active imagination really kicks in when you realize that the images have an autonomy and that you're
Yes.
responding to their autonomy. And you can't predict what that's going to be, because then they wouldn't have autonomy.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be alive. They'd just be some sort of, invented thing that you're doing by yourself.
And now that you know that, now that I know that, coming, this is an imagination chapter again, coming back in and reading Iamblichus and finding it as absolutely precise as that. Like, um, in the same way that in Aboriginal Australia, like there's big dream and little dream. Well, what does that mean? It's like, no, you just it just means that. Just go in. Like the big dreams are the big ones that move and are alive and have their own agency and autonomy because they are some kind of being, right? And it's almost as if you can't begin with assume the gods exist. Like you actually just have to live in the universe where these things are alive. Funny enough.
You know what I find to be kind of tragic, I would say, is that we human beings, I hate to say things like we human beings, but that we have experiences that are profound sometimes, but we have no way of giving them honor or
Yeah.
integrating them into our lives, because we have no language for it, no, no religion for it, you could say, or no system for it. And that's what I hope that Iamblichus and Neoplatonism can help provide,
Yeah.
that we can develop a language that can honor our own depth. And because we don't have that right now.
No.
Um,
That's it's and it is their waiting. So one of the final pieces just that reminded me of it from Aboriginal Australia. In some places, when you wake up in the morning, you will do something like whistle some kind of tune or make a pattern in the sand or whatever, just to, in response to what you just experienced in dream, to demonstrate that you are a being that moves between those realms, I guess. But
Yep.
it is ceremonially validating the reality that you just lived through, which we don't. Like I'm really haunted by that as well, where I have friends, or you'll have colleagues who will have strange experiences. I'll tell you this one, it's actually quite beautiful. So an older woman I worked with in London, her mother had died and she went back up to Yorkshire for the first Christmas without her mother. So it was her and her sister, and they're in the kitchen in Yorkshire preparing Christmas lunch. Yorkshire is not a warm place at Christmas. And all of a sudden, there's a butterfly in the kitchen. And my friend's sister's like, "Oh my God, look, it's mum. She's back. She's back." And because my friend is a Yorkshire woman, she's like, "It's a butterfly. It's not your mother." And she came back to the office, and my jaw is on the floor. She's telling me the story because I'm like, "Bitch, that was your mother." Do you get many? Do you get many butterflies on December 25 in Yorkshire? And she's like, "Well, no." And I'm like, "And what is the universal symbol for the soul?" But it was more like she had, and the look on her face of the realization, she just needed someone to say that's exactly what that was, because we don't do that, and it's awful. Like the millions of events that happen on a daily basis that are
Yeah.
like that. That is the universe talking to us. Like whatever that butterfly was, here is a woman and her sister doing Christmas, first time without their mother. That butterfly was something,
Oh,
and we don't give her anything for that. Those are the stories that haunt me, I think.
we're so cut off from our souls. Well, and Jung was right. Modern man in search of a soul.
Hmm.
We really are searching. It reminded me of that book by a fellow named Ian McGilchrist, where he talks about the how the rational aspect of the mind, it's supposed to simply be an emissary for our deeper, more intuitive, soulful part, but it's taken over,
Mm.
like a vizier who betrays his king and takes over the kingdom. That's what our rational minds have done to the world, forgetting our souls, and so that we can't even recognize that the butterfly is the way that her deceased mom is saying,
Mm.
"I'm still here."
Yeah.
And I want to be your butterfly, and I'm beautiful, and I love you. And she could have felt it and felt that connection. That's
Yeah. Ah,
that's
well, the work
that's
continues.
yeah, the
Mm.
work continues. Um, so this is a delight to be able to meet you, and I was unaware of your own work. Animistic is
Animistic? Yes, I'll send you one. We'll finish recording, and I'll get you details and have the publisher post you one.
oh, fantastic. That's
No,
fantastic.
absolutely. And speaking of books, obviously, other than Hellenic Tantra, which, as I said, best book I've read this year, what else would you give people on a? These people who listen to Rune Soup are definitely on the team. But what would you have them read in addition to Hellenic Tantra to like get a taste of Iamblichus and Theurgy, and potentially what they could make actionable out of that, I suppose.
Oh, that's well, you know what? One of my favorite authors is a woman named Sarah Abel Rapp, or sometimes just Sarah Rapp, R-A-P-P-E. She's written a book called Reading Neoplatonism, which is a little bit heady and difficult, but profound. But then she wrote a book on Socrates and Socratic ignorance and Platonic wisdom, I think. And her analysis of Socrates, and she compares him to traditions, say in Sufi traditions or in Buddhist traditions, and she portrays Socrates as a kind of avatar of our Western culture, like an incarnation, like a Krishna, you could say, for the Hindus. That's Socrates, and she is able to convey that very well. So I would say look up Sarah, and it's Ahbel hyphen Rappe. Sarah Rapp. She really writes well about Neoplatonism. Not entirely focused on theurgy, but certainly on the depth of the tradition, and what she says about Socrates is quite amazing. I wrote a review of that book. I'd be glad to send it to you if you're
Awesome.
interested.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I've not heard of her. I'll put them on my wish list now that I'm back somewhere where books can be delivered. That will be.
And I think that you mentioned Crystal Addy.
Yeah,
She's
yeah,
she's
yeah. Yeah.
she's very good. And Algis Uzdavinis is somebody that people have found very inspiring, and he's a kind of a wild man of an academic. He's no longer with us. He died, unfortunately, about 8 years ago. Um, but he's just inspired kind of writer, pulling threads from every direction and making sense of them. Uzdavinis, Algis Uzdavinis. He's quite quite worth checking out.
Very cool. All
He
right.
writes with, he's one of these people that can't write unless he's in an inspired state.
Yeah. Okay.
Everything he writes is almost like frothing with a presence. And he writes about theurgy and the Chaldean oracles and material like that. So he's somebody you might check out.
Will
Algis
do.
Davinis, more
Fantastic.
specifically down that line of Neoplatonism. Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, Professor Shaw, thank you very much once again for your time and for the fantastic book. And we'll have to do this again. It's really cool.
I'm really
Really cool
glad to
material.
meet you, and you're really doing a lot of cool things, and I'm delighted to have met you. And let's stay in touch, please.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.